A lot of people, again, disappointed with a short track race at Martinsville. Felt like it was, pretty much a dominated race by Hendrick Motorsports, which they finished 1, 2, 3. So, that pretty much sums that up. Not a super competitive race as far as a lot of side-by-side racing, though, as we talked about in the first segment, guys did pass. There were a few guys that did pass, but a lot of drivers said they couldn't pass. And Elton Sawyer of NASCAR did get on Sirius this week and say, we got some work to do in the short track package. So the question now is, what can they do?
That's a $10,000 question, Brett. If I knew, I probably would not be sitting here with you guys. I can promise you that. It's tough, though, because they've tried to adjust the tire, or so they say. They're going to get more aggressive with that. Them and Goodyear kind of working in tandem. The drivers have been screaming, crying for more horsepower for years, but I think that they've kind of understood and now understand that it's not the easiest solution or fix. And regardless of what the engine builders say and how easy it is to implement, it's just not going to happen as quickly as they want it to. And I wish that I had a solution. I wish that I had the minds of these tire people that make tires, or, people that have all these different power to weight ratio formulas in their head. I don't. I'm just watching what I see on the racetrack. And on one hand, it's interesting because everybody is so close. So the margins are so thin. And that's why you see kind of cars packed up all together. And a couple weeks ago, the closest finish literally in the history of NASCAR, 76 years worth. But on the other hand, since everybody's so close, they're running the same speed. And to Denny's point on his podcast this week, it's hard to pass. And I know that William did it. We talked about that, but he is one of the rare people that was able to do that with relative ease. It seems like everybody has now kind of stabilized a little bit in year 3 of this Generation 7 next-gen car. And Elton Sawyer spoke to that as well. Having a lot of data points on this car, guys, makes everybody able to drive it a little bit better. Maybe not easier, but they're able to drive it better, and they understand it a little bit more. I wonder if that's part of the reason why we're seeing what we're seeing right now on the short tracks, is that people have kind of figured out what makes the car tick and how to get the most out of it.
I mean, the drivers, to the point that Davey was making, Josh, the drivers keep saying, we need more power, but that means you're going to get into the engine, which means you're going to start having a lot more expense, which I know NASCAR is trying to avoid. So I don't know where you go after that. I mean, the drivers, obviously, they know something. They're the guys in the car.
Yeah.
But there would seem to be a simpler solution. We've talked a lot about, especially after the Bristol race, tires giving up and putting it into the driver's hands. From that standpoint, making tire management something that mattered. But the challenge for Goodyear is finding that they didn't plan on that for Bristol, but finding that balance where they can do that.
Yeah, and that's the thing about Bristol. To that point, they didn't plan on that, but it turned out being, for viewers, a very interesting race, watching the way that the drivers had to manage those tires and the way they had to calculate how to play that race out. The veterans had a ball with it. It was old school racing for them, and that made it interesting. And there are other guys that were riding in the back that were just frustrated and wanted that day to end. And we talked about it on our call after that race at Bristol, and those races are interesting, but we also don't want to have that each and every week. So it's a delicate balance, right? Because you want to figure out some way to make this short track package work. And if you could get a happy medium with the tires and make it so it makes these races a little more interesting. So you have more guys passing, more comers and goers, more pack racing in a way. But at the same time, it's really hard to figure it out. And I think at this point, all we can ask for is that you just keep working on it until you figure something out. Like, that's the good thing. They haven't given up and be like, well, this is what you have. Go out and figure it out. To Davey's point, if I had the answer, then we'd be good. But it's one of these things that they just have to keep chipping away at, and hopefully they can figure it out. Because you don't want to necessarily, while it's a huge day for Hendrick, you don't want to necessarily have a race where you're like, well, we saw what happened at the end. We saw what happened in the beginning. In the middle, like, I can take it or leave it. And that's the last thing you want.
Well, I mean, keep it in mind, you've only got 6 short track races on the schedule, because I don't consider Phoenix a short track, Davey. Is there a chance that maybe we're romanticizing short track racing, thinking back to what it was, when in fact it really wasn't what people think it was? I mean, you look back into history, People go, the racing was a lot better back in the day. You mean back when two guys finished on the lead lap?
Right.
I mean, or maybe we were romanticizing this to the extent that maybe the races weren't as great as we thought they were.
I think there's definitely an element of that for sure. And I'll defer to you guys on that too, because,
You say
given
we're
my
old?
age, I wasn't around for all of those old school races and whatnot. But at the same time, I've seen highlights. I've talked to people that covered the sport that were participating in those races. So I think that there's an element of that. But I also think, there's a lot of people that I've heard, whether it's drivers, industry members, et cetera, that are saying right now the short tracks are dying, not just in the greater American landscape, but in NASCAR specifically because of the product or maybe the lack thereof that we're seeing on track. I think that may be a bit harsh, but at the same time, there is some truth to that statement as well, because as we know, NASCAR was built on short tracks: Martinsville, Bristol, Richmond, Nashville Fairgrounds, North Wilkesboro, all these tracks that some we still race on, some we don't anymore. That's what NASCAR was built on. And that's where the beating and banging, if you ain't rubbing, you ain't racing, all the cliches that you want to use, they come from short tracks, right? So the fact that on these types of tracks now, we're not getting the racing that we are accustomed to seeing. I think days of lapping the field and everybody finishing 3 laps down are obviously long gone. But still, the product that we were able to see even just 5, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it's drastically different because the car is obviously different. The tires are different. The information and the technology that's available to all of these teams and drivers is more readily available. And that's different. And just in general, sports evolve, as does life. And I think that this is kind of one of the unintended consequences that we've seen of the Gen 7 car. And that is that the intermediate track racing has improved. Super speedways, I think, have improved. Road courses and short tracks, though, unfortunately, they have been hurt a little bit. Unintended consequence. I know that was not the plan. Nobody's going to plan for things to suffer, but this is something that needs to be, and I think it is, on the front burner of NASCAR's to-do list, because you cannot afford to go back to Bristol, to go back to Martinsville, and even Richmond, even though that's not in the playoffs. Martinsville's the penultimate race of the year, guys. You can't afford to have what we saw this past Sunday in the second to last race of the year. I think that they're going to be able to fix it to a certain extent. I just hope that they're able to do enough.
Josh, let me get your thoughts on what we were talking about. Have we romanticized these tracks to the point that we're actually getting the same type of racing we had before? And then let me throw another element in.
Yeah.
Perception is reality.
Mm-hmm.
That these tracks, when times are good, added tens of thousands of seats. Well, now they have taken some down. They have covered some up. But when they look on TV, they see empty seats. And even though the crowd may be the same thing it was 30 years ago, it looks a lot more sparse because there were a lot. I mean, I don't know what the crowd was at Bristol this year, but it may have been 50 or 60,000. That's a lot of people. Mm-hmm. But at Bristol, it looks like there are not many people there.
Yeah, and that's the tough thing about it, right? Because there's two schools of thought, right? It's when you're at the racetrack and you see all the fans and you see the infields packed and you see all the campers and stuff like that. And, from that aspect, when I'm at the track, I'm like, man, there's a lot of people. And then, you go home and you're rewatching the race and you see the shots from above and you see the stands and you're like, man, that's not a lot of people. Like, what happened here? And to the first point, when you talk about romanticizing the old days, I mean, I think we do that with any sport, right? We're always talking about how everything was so much better back in the day and the racing was better, or football was better, or basketball was better. I think that's just the nature of humans. It's what we do. And maybe to that point, there were specific races that were better, and there are others you'll look back and be like, that wasn't as great as I remember it. And the same thing today, you're not going to hit on every single, you would love to, but it's a long season. There's, to that point, there's multiple short tracks. Some of them are going to be great. Some of them are going to be less great, for lack of a better term. But you just hope that you could have a hit rate where you hit more when it matters. And to Davey's point, you can't go back to the penultimate race and have it look like it did, this past weekend. You need a little more drama. You need a little more action. And, that's something that, to that point, you guys have said they're going to have to figure it out. But you know, you just hope it's not too late.